So let's talk about some of the findings on pasture NRI. This is a report that Eric talked about in his presentation. He also mentioned the pasture resource assessment report from NRI. That was just from 2013, as he said, when it started, through 2016. And that report was published in June of 2018. So all of the information I'm showing comes from that report. So as was stated very well earlier, so there are regions of NRI. When it comes to pasture, there's not very many data points yet to draw some of these findings that we're going to see here in a little bit. So these are the NRI pasture regions. So I work mainly in the Northeast, Southeast, and part of the Midwest states. So I may make some statements about those, but I'm going to try to not say anything about species or draw conclusions about those from the Northern Plains, South Central, or West. So Ken talked about this, and it's true on the pasture land use also. Noxious and invasive species are present on 38% to 65% of the pastures. So that's considering all regions. There are short forage and weed species that dominate significant portions of our pasture land. So when I think about this, this is somewhat anecdotal, but I think about if I looked at this as a pasture, if I came to a pasture that had short forage and weed species, what does that tell me about the pasture? And what do the things that you're going to hear about following tell me about that pasture? We didn't have enough data to draw strong conclusions, but some of the species that showed up regularly in almost every region were Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, crabgrass often. So what are the situations where those species can survive being grazed and being grazed often, and what opportunities do they need for light and those kinds of things to do well? The resource concerns that we should be aware of that we found also, just as Ken mentioned, sheet and rill erosion, classic gully, stream bank or shoreline erosion. That was more than just a few percentage points where that occurred on pasture land use in those NRI regions. Also, resource concerns of organic matter depletion and compaction is occurring on 15 to 35% of the pastures in the Midwest, Northeast, Southeast, and South Central regions. We also have resource concerns of plant productivity, health, and vigor, and forage quality and palatability concerns on a quarter to half of the pasture land, except for the Northern Plains region, but all the other regions, those were a strong concern. So again, let's think about, okay, picture a pasture where those are the concerns. There's also inadequate stock water on 40 to 52% of the pasture in the Midwest, Northeast, and Southeast. Well, let's look at what conservation practices have been applied to pasture. Irrigation water management on 10 to 22% in the Northern Plains and West NRI regions has been applied. Pasture and hay planting, close to 20% to 40% of the NRI regions. That's good. Watering facilities, 10 to 32% of the pasture in most NRI regions has been applied. And prescribed grazing has been applied to 11% to 45% of some NRI regions. But what conservation practices are needed? So we still need pasture and hay planting on 12 to 32% of the pasture in the Midwest, Northeast, South Central, Southeast, and the West NRI regions. 18 to 50% of all the NRI regions need watering facilities. That 50%, that's a large number. Prescribed grazing is needed on 36% to 58%, considering all NRI regions. So when you think about that and all the resource concerns we noted, what kind of species were there, it's not unusual to see this in the photo in the background of this slide. Lots of bare ground, only species existing that can take being grazed very, very short, or that the cattle refused to eat. So in my mind, that shows us we've got some overgrazing going on. And if we look at the National Ag Statistics Service, some of their data that's actually filled out by livestock producers, we probably have some overstocked situations out there as well. Let's dig a little deeper and make sure we understand what is pastureland NRI. Gene talked about the protocols that were done. All but just a few protocols are the same that we do on pasture. There's just a few that we do. Obviously, we don't do rangeland health. We do pasture condition scoring. We also do standing biomass, not plant production. And certainly on pasture, we don't do sagebrush shape. So why is it taking longer, besides just starting later, to get some of these NRI points so we can really begin to look at some things, seeing what's happening, possibly some trends on pasture. You note here in the eastern half of this map, Gene showed this too, I believe, we have three main land uses there: cropland, pasture land, and forest land. And so that's very typical. There are farms that are just pasture or just cropland, certainly, but many livestock operations that we go to also have some cropland and some forest land. So it takes longer to be able to get those points when we've got lots of different land uses going on. Most of the pasture land, as you can see, is east of this red line, but certainly we have important and valuable pasture, the pasture land use going on west of this line as well. A lot of irrigated acres at higher elevations, and certainly where there's higher rainfall when you look at some of the West Coast areas. What's happened with pasture land, Eric talked about when some of those first studies began to be done. So total pasture acres, 1982 to 2017, it went from 131 million acres to 121 million acres in 2017. So certainly there's been a loss. And as was shown, there's also been a loss in rangeland and grazed forest land. But just to note that there has been a loss. So we want to talk more about those invasive species. As Ken mentioned, definitely a problem as we look at those western NRI regions on the pasture land use. Those annual brooms and cheatgrass are a problem there also. We see reed canary grass, Johnson grass, Japanese stilt grass, see that a lot as you get more into the eastern pasture land use. And with Johnson grass, just wanted to say that it's usually not a problem in pasture because it's usually consumed by the livestock. But when it comes to hay, then it's very much not wanted in those situations. We certainly have invasive forbs. The thistles are a problem, particularly Canada thistle, bull thistle, have been a problem for pastures, and unfortunately seems to be increasing. And certainly we have invasive woody species. Ken talked about the juniper species, red cedar, mesquite. In the east, multiflora rose is a big problem of an invasive woody. You can see in the pasture behind this multiflora rose plant in the fence row. They're a problem in pastures as well, and so that is a problem that's taking valuable space for the forages that we want the animals to be grazing. So that's something that should be noted. In summary, we could find from these findings that we have invasive plants. It's a concern. We need to be thinking, how can we better control those? We have erosion problems, runoff, and nutrients are the biggest pasture concerns. Prescribed grazing, livestock watering facilities, and forage planting are the most needed conservation practices. So we know that as we continue to sample NRI points in the future, over time, the NRI data will reveal if NRCS conservation efforts address these pasture lands needs. So thank you. That's all I have to present today.